1431. The jungle city of Angkor. Nearly 1 million people woke up in the largest city on planet Earth. By nightfall, they were fleeing for their lives. The greatest civilization Southeast Asia had ever seen didn't fall to invasion. It didn't collapse from plague. It died from something far more terrifying, something that's happening again right now. And until a team of archaeologists pointed lasers through the Cambodian jungle 5 years ago, we had no idea what actually killed Angkor. What they found changes everything we thought we knew about why civilizations die. It is what historians told us for over a century. The Khmer Empire fell because Thai armies invaded in 1431, sacked the capital, and the survivors simply walked away. Clean. Simple. Wrong. Because when archaeologists finally mapped what lay beneath the jungle canopy, they discovered something that shattered that narrative completely. Angkor wasn't just a city. It was a hydraulic machine, the most sophisticated water management system the ancient world had ever seen. 400 square miles of canals, reservoirs, and channels, all invisible from the ground. And every single piece of that machine had failed catastrophically, decades before the Thai ever arrived. The invasion didn't kill Angkor. Something else did. Something the Khmer brought upon themselves. And to understand how 1 million people could simply vanish, we need to go back to the beginning. To when the Khmer discovered the one thing that made impossible cities possible. 802 AD. A king named Khajavarman II stood on a mountain called Penom Kulin and declared himself a god king, a Devaraja. It wasn't arrogance. It was strategy. Because Jayavarman understood something his rivals didn't: whoever controlled water controlled everything. The Tunnel Sap, Southeast Asia's largest freshwater lake, performed an annual miracle. During monsoon season, it swelled to 5 times its normal size. When the rain stopped, it shrank, leaving behind some of the most fertile soil on Earth. But the monsoons were unpredictable. Some years brought floods that destroyed everything. Other years brought drought that starved entire populations. Khajavarman's genius was seeing that if you could capture the flood and release it during drought, you could grow rice 3 times a year instead of once. You could feed armies, build monuments, create an empire. Within 200 years, his descendants had built the largest pre-industrial city in human history. At its peak, Angkor was home to nearly 1 million people, when London had barely 50,000. But here's where I need you to shift how you're thinking about this. Forget the temples. Forget Angkor Wat. Those were just the showpieces, the parts tourists photograph today. The real Angkor was invisible. Beneath the jungle floor, archaeologists have now mapped over 1,000 artificial ponds. Canals stretching for hundreds of miles. Reservoirs so vast you could fit entire modern cities inside them. The West Boray alone held over 53 million cubic meters of water, enough to supply a city of 1 million for months during the driest years. And every single drop was moved without pumps. Without electricity. We see nothing but gravity and an understanding of hydrology that engineers today still struggle to fully comprehend. The Khmer had built a civilization that bent nature to its will. They had solved water. Or so they thought. Because the very system that made Angkor possible contained a fatal flaw. A weakness that wouldn't become apparent for 400 years. And when it finally revealed itself, there would be no recovery. At the empire's height under King Jayavarman VII in the late 1100s, Angkor was performing miracles daily. The king built more stone structures in 40 years than all his predecessors combined. Angkor Thom, his new capital, covered over 3.5 square miles, surrounded by walls and a moat that held enough water to sustain the city through any drought. The Bayan temple at its center featured 200 stone faces, each one bearing the king's own smile. It was hubris carved in stone. And it required staggering resources. Archaeologists estimate that constructing Angkor Wat alone required 6 million blocks of sandstone, each weighing up to 1,500 pounds. They quarried it from mountains 30 miles away, floated it down canals, and carved it with nothing but iron tools and human hands. But here's what that construction demanded: trees. Millions of them. To fire the kilns that made the lime mortar. To build the scaffolding. To fuel the forges. To cook food for the hundreds of thousands of workers. And every tree they cut was one less root holding the soil in place above those critical canals. The first signs of trouble came in the early 1300s. After 4 centuries of monsoons, sediment had been slowly filling the massive reservoirs. Each year, they held a little less water. Each year, the canals required more maintenance. The Khmer had always been master engineers, surely they could fix it. And they tried. Archaeological evidence shows frantic repair work throughout this period. Channels rerouted. Reservoirs strengthened. New spillways carved. But the empire was already overextended. Military campaigns in every direction. Temple construction that never stopped. A bureaucracy that had grown bloated over centuries. And now the climate itself began to turn against them. Three-ring data from Vietnam has revealed something no chronicle recorded. Starting in the 1340s, Southeast Asia entered one of the most severe drought periods in half a millennium. The monsoons that Angkor depended on began to fail. Not every year, but often enough. And when the rains did come, they came as mega monsoons, catastrophic floods that overwhelmed the damaged infrastructure. The machine was breaking. And no one knew how to stop it. But here's the thing, everything I've just told you? That's still not what killed Angkor. Because the Khmer had survived droughts before. They repaired infrastructure before. Empires don't collapse from single causes. They collapse when multiple systems fail simultaneously. And what archaeologists discovered in 2016 changes everything. Using airborne laser scanning, a team mapped an area the size of New York City around Angkor. What they found beneath the jungle canopy wasn't just a failed water system. It was evidence of a cascade failure. The deforestation had destabilized the watersheds above the city. When mega monsoons hit, they didn't just flood, they scoured. Massive erosion events carved new channels, bypassing the reservoirs entirely. And in the droughts that followed, there was no water left to release. The 3 harvest per year system collapsed to 1, if they were lucky. But even that doesn't explain why 1 million people abandoned their homes. To understand that, you have to understand what happened to the one thing the Khmer Empire could not survive losing: fight. The Khmer kings weren't just rulers. They were gods on earth, living connections between humanity and the divine. Their legitimacy came from a simple promise: worship me, and I will bring the waters. For 4 centuries, they delivered. The reservoirs filled. The rice grew. The empire prospered. But by the late 1300s, that contract was broken. Inscriptions from this period reveal a civilization in spiritual crisis. Temples that once glorified Hindu gods began shifting to Buddhist imagery. The god-king system was being quietly abandoned. And why wouldn't it be? The kings had promised water. The water wasn't coming. When the Thai armies finally arrived in 1431, they weren't conquering a thriving empire. They were raiding a corpse. The population had already begun scattering into the countryside, returning to the subsistence farming their ancestors had practiced before the god kings promised something better. The sack of Angkor wasn't a conquest, it was a funeral. And within decades, the jungle had begun reclaiming the greatest city the world had ever seen. For 500 years, the jungle kept Angkor's secrets. French explorers in the 1860s couldn't believe what they found: temples so vast they assumed they must have been built by some lost Roman colony. The idea that Southeast Asians had built the largest city in the medieval world didn't fit their worldview. But the jungle revealed something else those explorers couldn't see. Something far more important than architecture. When the vegetation was finally mapped using 21st century technology, researchers discovered that Angkor's collapse left a scar visible from space. Sediment cores from the tunnel sap show a sudden spike in erosion around 1400, the same period the water system failed. Bylin records show the forests never fully recovered in the areas closest to the ancient city. The Khmer didn't just build an empire. They terraformed the landscape. And when their system collapsed, it took the environment with it. The jungle that swallowed Angkor wasn't recovery. It was a different ecosystem entirely, one growing on the ruins of what came before. Now, I want you to think about something for a moment. What I've described is an ancient history. It's a pattern. A civilization builds infrastructure to control nature. That infrastructure allows population growth beyond what the land could naturally support. Success encourages expansion, more construction, more resources, more pressure on the systems that made success possible. And then the climate shifts. Not dramatically. Used enough to stress systems already operating at maximum capacity. The Khmer faced droughts that lasted decades. They faced megafloods that destroyed what drought hadn't killed. And they faced something modern societies don't want to talk about, the realization that the systems we build to control nature can fail in ways we never anticipated. Because here's what keeps archaeologists up at night, the 2016 scans revealed something else. Angkor wasn't alone. The same LiDAR technology has now revealed dozens of similar hydraulic cities across Southeast Asia, all from the same period, all collapsed within centuries of each other. Angkor wasn't an anomaly. It was the largest example of a regional system failure. The parallels are uncomfortable. Today, over 2 billion people depend on the Mekong River basin, the same watershed the Khmer transformed. Modern cities like Bangkok, Phnom Penh, and Ho Chi Minh City sit on floodplains managed by systems not that different from Angkor's reservoirs. And the same climate patterns that destroyed the Khmer Empire are intensifying again. The 2011 Thailand floods displaced over 13 million people, the costliest natural disaster in Thai history. The Mekong's annual flood pulse, which sustained civilizations for millennia, is becoming erratic as upstream dams and climate change disrupt flows. What the Khmer discovered is what every hydraulic civilization eventually learns: water systems create dependencies. They allow populations to grow beyond natural limits. And when they fail, when the rains stop coming or come too hard, there's no going back to simpler times. But understanding why Angkor collapsed also reveals something else. Something that offers a strange kind of hope. The Khmer didn't vanish. That's the misconception that persists. When archaeologists trace the sediment, the pollen, the genetic data, they find that the population of Angkor didn't die. They dispersed. They moved to the tunnel sap, to smaller communities, to the coasts. They abandoned the unsustainable city and returned to sustainable villages. Within a generation, the descendants of the empire's citizens had become fishermen, rice farmers, the ancestors of modern Cambodians. The temples fell. The reservoirs silted up. The god kings became myth. But the people survived, because they were able to leave a system that no longer worked. And that's the answer to the question I posed at the beginning: what really killed Angkor? It wasn't drought. It wasn't invasion. It wasn't even the cascade failure of the water system. What killed Angkor was the same thing that kills every civilization built on the premise that nature can be permanently controlled: the refusal to adapt until adaptation is no longer possible. The Khmer who survived were the ones who recognized when the system had failed and walked away. The ones who stayed, who believed the god kings could still bring the water, they're the million people who vanished. Today, Angkor Wat receives over 2 million visitors per year. They come to photograph the sunrise, to marvel at the architecture, to check off a bucket list item. Mostly thinking they've seen a ruin. They haven't. They've seen a warning. The Khmer built the most sophisticated pre-industrial civilization in human history. They fed 1 million people in a region that could naturally support a fraction of that. And they did it by creating systems so complex, so interdependent, that when one part failed, everything failed. We've built those same systems, except now they span continents. Our food travels thousands of miles through supply chains that would make the Khmer's canal network look simple. Our cities depend on water from aquifers that are draining faster than they refill. And our climate is shifting in ways the Khmer never could have imagined. Angkor teaches us that civilizations don't collapse overnight. They collapse slowly, then all at once. The question isn't whether our systems will be tested. The question is whether we'll recognize failure before it's too late to walk away. The jungle still grows over Angkor. But the lesson it holds has never been more alive. Now you know what really happened to the world's largest city, and why it matters for ours. If this video made you think differently about how civilizations end, that subscribe button lets you join 300,000 others who are discovering history's hidden warnings. Drop a comment: which fallen empire should we investigate next? The Maya? The Arappans? Rome? Your suggestion might become our next deep dive. Because every collapse has lessons. And those lessons are waiting in the ruins.